Hey folks, this is Ben, the creator of fiddleware Subtitles. And I'm just going to give a really quick demonstration of how to use fiddleware Subtitles to create caption files for your various video projects. So I'm just going to jump right in here and actually create a new project. And to do that, you just hit the Create a Project button. Now this opens a little dialog box here that allows you to select a video source. And you have three options for selecting a video source. You can either embed a Vimeo video, a YouTube video, or you can even select a local video file from your hard drive. Now I'm just going to go ahead here and select YouTube. Since I already have a video URL copied, I'm just going to paste that in here. And I'm going to click Create a Project. Now it's going to ask me to sign in. And this is just so that I can always come back later and continue working on the project. And you have various options to sign in. You can either sign in with your Google account, your Facebook account, your Twitter account, or if you want, you can use a traditional email/password account. Now I'm just going to go ahead and click sign in with Google since it's probably the easiest. It's going to log me in and create the project, and I'm presented with the main project viewing area right here. Now when we open our project here, we have three main work areas. We've got our playback area. Now this is where the video plays and our YouTube video is embedded. We have our play and pause button. We can choose to change the playback rate of our video. So if we find that the audio is just a little too fast for us to transcribe, we can always slow it down. Or if we want, we can even speed it up a little bit too. And we also have the looping option, which by default is set to 5 seconds. Now what this means is that by default, our captions will be 5 seconds in duration. And when we insert a caption, when we are working with a caption and we're playing the video will loop for those 5 seconds. So if it reaches the end of the caption and we haven't quite finished transcribing the audio for that, or we miss something, it will automatically go back and start over from the beginning of those 5 seconds. Now we also have our main caption text node area, and this is the area where we do most of our work, where we insert our captions and delete them and so on. Caption button, and this will insert a caption at the current time in the timeline. And we have our hints button. This will just give us a little, give us sort of our shortcuts for various common functions or functionality that we perform, such as changing the duration of a caption or entering a new caption and so on. We have our import and export buttons, and these are pretty self-explanatory. We can import an SRT file directly into our project area, and we can export our project to an SRT file, which allows us to watch or use our captions in conjunction with our videos in various different contexts. Finally, we have our timeline right here, and our timeline is important because it allows us to sort of have an overall picture of what our project looks like. So when we actually add a new caption to our timeline, it'll actually appear on, when we add a new caption to our project, it will actually appear on the timeline. And we can choose to click it and navigate our video and our project through this timeline. So let me get started here and actually show you how you go about captioning. So I'm just going to click here to start captioning. I'm going to hit that. And you can see it starts playing back the video. It's inserted a new caption in our captions area, and it's inserted a corresponding caption on our timeline. The video is looping for 5 seconds, which allows us to transcribe any audio that exists within those 5 seconds. Now in these 5 seconds, there isn't actually any audio transcribed, so I'm just going to hit return. And because the current caption is empty, it will actually delete that caption for us and insert a new caption in the 5 seconds following this caption. So we've skipped to the next 5 seconds, and we're looping for the next 5 seconds. Again, there's no audio to transcribe, so I'm going to hit return. Again, return. And hopefully, here we've got some. So I'm actually going to hit return and start, create a new caption. Now you can see that this caption actually begins in the middle of a sentence. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Command U, and this will start the caption 0.5 seconds earlier than it currently does. I'm going to hit this until I find it's at the correct position. Alright, well, that seems about good. Gotta wait for it. I'll actually slow it down a little bit here for me. It's talking pretty quickly. Not sure if that's the correct spelling, but I'm just going to go with it. No, I think he actually... So I'm actually going to... now I'm going to hit return. We'll get to the next 5 seconds. Alright, so that gives you a really basic idea of how you would go about creating your captions. And you can see here it's entered 2 captions on the timeline. Now the captions themselves are meaningful. The height represents the words per minute of the caption. So if you have a really short caption in terms of duration that contains many words, it will actually be very tall on the timeline. And the color will change. If the caption is red, it means that you probably have too many words per minute. If it's orange/yellow, it probably means that it's borderline. And if it's blue, it's alright. Now the width of the caption represents its duration. So if you have a really long caption in terms of duration, it will be longer on the timeline. Now if you click the caption, it'll resync the video to that caption's time and refocus the the corresponding text node. See, like this. Now if you click on the caption in the text node area, it will resync the video and it will sync the timeline. So everything is totally in sync here, and I think it really makes it easy to keep track of your various captions and go back and forth between them. Now when you're done, you simply hit export. And what this will do is it will generate a SRT file for you, and it will actually download it to your downloads folder. And you can use this SRT file as you would any other SRT file. You can upload it to YouTube if you want, or you can use it alongside your videos in Windows Media Player or QuickTime or whatever, or VLC or whatever playback program you're using. So that's just a really quick introduction to fiddleware subtitles, and I hope you find it useful. So thanks.